Tonight, let us begin a journey into the past. A slow, gentle journey, not hurried, but told in calm reflection, so that each word carries us deeper into stillness. It is the story of a man whose name has echoed across centuries, carved into stone, written in books, whispered in Oi Alexander, Alexander the Great. But before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself. Rest your head upon your pillow. Let your body find its comfort. Dim the lights around you, or let the soft dark of evening cradle you. Perhaps there is a quiet sound nearby, the turning of a fan, the sigh of night air through a window, the muted rhythm of your own breath. Allow those sounds to steady you, to become part of the silence we are about to enter together. And as always, if this kind of calm, reflective storytelling brings you peace, consider listening again another night. But only if it feels right for you. For now, let us travel backward in time. Let us step away from the present and into the fragile light of another world. It is July, in the year 356 BCE. The kingdom of Macedon lies at the edge of Greece, a land of broad plains and mountain shadows. Its capital is Pella, where palaces rise of pale stone, their courtyards cool with fountains, their walls painted with vivid colours. Outside the city, the fields ripple with wheat and barley. Hills climb toward forests of oak and pine. Rivers wind through the valleys, glinting like silver threads. Here, beneath the summer sun, a child enters the world. He is born in the palace of King Philip II and his queen, Olympias. On that same day, it is said, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned in far-off Asia. A fire some later claimed was an omen, that the goddess herself was absent, attending instead the birth of one who would one day set the world aflame. The child's name is Alexander. To understand the boy, we must first understand the land into which he was born. Macedon was not Athens, with its crowded agora, nor Sparta, with its iron discipline. It was a frontier kingdom, rougher, broader, less polished. The plains stretched wide, good for horses. Herds galloped over meadows, their hooves drumming against the earth. Farmers bent to their fields, their scythes flashing in the light, while shepherds guided flocks along rocky paths. The seasons shaped every life. In spring, rains softened the soil, filling the rivers, making the grass thick for grazing. In summer, heat pressed down, and the air shimmered above the stones. Autumn was the time of harvest, barns filling with grain, jars filling with wine. In winter, frost lay heavy on the fields. Smoke curled from hearths, and the people gathered indoors, waiting for the days to lengthen again. This was the rhythm Alexander first knew, a rhythm of cycles, of struggle and renewal, of earth and sky in balance. But Alexander did not live the life of a farmer or a shepherd. He was a prince, raised within the halls of Pella. The palace was not as grand as the marble temples of Athens, but to a child's eyes it must have seemed endless. Long corridors echoed with the steps of servants. Courtyards opened into gardens where fountains trickled. Walls were painted with images of hunts and gods, lions leaping, heroes striding. Here, Alexander grew beneath the watchful eyes of his parents. His father, Philip, was a man of iron will, a king who had taken Macedon from weakness to power, forging an army unlike any other in Greece. His mother, Olympias, was fierce and devout, a woman of passion and mystery, who whispered to her son that he was descended from heroes, perhaps even from Zeus himself. Between them, Alexander learned both the hardness of kingship and the fire of belief. There is a story told of his youth. One day, a great horse was brought before Philip. The animal was strong, black, restless. Its name was Bucephalus. No one could tame it. It reared, struck out with its hooves, bit at the reins. The courtiers laughed, saying it was useless. But Alexander, only a boy, stepped forward. He had noticed something the others had not. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Slowly, he turned Bucephalus toward the sun, so that the shadow fell behind. He stroked its neck, spoke softly, mounted, and rode. The horse obeyed. The crowd gasped, and Philip wept with pride. He said, "My son, seek out a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Whether the story happened exactly this way we cannot know, but the truth beneath it is clear. Even as a child, Alexander's gift was not only bravery, but vision, to see what others overlooked, to act where others mocked. When Alexander was old enough, his father brought him a teacher whose name endures, Aristotle. The philosopher came to Pella to guide the boy in letters and thought. Under Aristotle, Alexander learned not only Greek poetry and history, but science, medicine, and philosophy. He studied plants and animals, stars and seas, the works of Homer and the plays of Euripides. And yet, for all the wisdom of books, he was still a boy of restless spirit. He carried the Iliad with him always, sleeping with it under his pillow. To him, Achilles was not only a figure of legend, but an ideal to be lived, swift, brave, glorious, remembered forever. It is worth pausing here with him in these early years. Imagine Alexander in the palace gardens, sitting beneath an olive tree, a scroll of Homer unrolled in his lap. The air is warm, cicadas hum in the branches. Beyond the walls, horses stamp in the fields, and the voices of soldiers rise in training chants. The boy reads slowly, mouthing the words of Achilles' rage, of Hector's courage, of Troy's walls burning. His eyes are bright, his mind already wandering far beyond Pella. Picture him then at night, lying in bed. The torches in the halls flicker low. The palace grows quiet. Outside, the stars spread across the Macedonian sky, vast and cold. He whispers to himself lines of poetry, dreaming of battles, of cities, of glory. In these moments, he is not yet a conqueror. He is a child, but a child who believes that destiny is already calling. This is the beginning, a boy born in Pella, in a summer of omens. A boy taught by kings and philosophers, guided by horses and heroes. A boy who dreamed not of the life before him, but of a world waiting beyond the horizon. The world does not yet know his name, but in the palace of Pella, in the hills of Macedon, in the quiet breath of a child's sleep, Alexander has already begun. When we last left him, Alexander was a boy in Pella, reading Homer beneath olive trees, dreaming of heroes while the stars of Macedon stretched overhead. But a boy's dreams soon give way to a young man's training, and a prince's childhood always lives in the shadow of kings. To understand Alexander's youth, we must look first at his father, Philip II of Macedon. For it was Philip who shaped the kingdom into a weapon, and Philip whose shadow Alexander both admired and struggled against. Philip was no ordinary monarch. Before his reign, Macedon had been a fractured land, its nobility quarrelsome, its army a patchwork of peasants and horsemen. But Philip saw possibility where others saw weakness. He reorganized the army into the phalanx, a wall of men wielding sarissas, long spears twice the length of a Greek hoplites, with these spears bristling in close formation. The Macedonian infantry became like a moving forest of iron, impenetrable to frontal assault. He drilled his men endlessly, teaching them discipline until they moved as one. He trained cavalry to strike in coordination with infantry, hammer and anvil crushing foes between them. He forged alliances, broke enemies, and by the time Alexander was a youth, Philip had turned Macedon from a backwater kingdom into the strongest power in Greece. This was the world Alexander grew up in, a kingdom forged by iron, sharpened by ambition, ruled by a father whose victories stretched across battlefields, and whose presence filled every hall. As Philip drilled armies, Alexander trained among the sons of Macedonian nobles. These companions would later ride with him into Asia, but first they learned together the arts of war and leadership. Days began with riding. The sun barely risen, the boys mounted horses and galloped across fields, learning to control speed, to wheel in formation, to trust animal and comrade alike. Their instructors demanded precision. A cavalry charge was not chaos but rhythm, the pounding of hooves in measured lines. After riding came hunting. In Macedon, hunting was more than sport, it was training for war. Alexander and his peers stalked deer through forests, chased boar with spears, brought down lions on the slopes of Mount Olympus. Each kill tested courage and skill, and each failure brought bruises, torn flesh, and lessons that could not be forgotten. Then came lessons indoors. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander read of ethics, politics, philosophy. He memorized Homer's lines, studied the tragedies of Aeschylus, learned the order of the heavens as the philosopher explained the movement of stars. Yet even here, the boy's restlessness showed itself. He asked questions that surprised even Aristotle. Why do rivers carve valleys? Why does the sea not overflow the land? Why do men fight for glory, even knowing death awaits? It was as though his mind already lived on both planes, the battlefield and the cosmos, steel and stars. If Philip gave Alexander his army, Olympias gave him fire. She was proud, passionate, and deeply religious, devoted to the mysteries of Dionysus and to dreams of destiny. To Alexander she whispered that his line descended not merely from kings, but from heroes, from Achilles, from Heracles, even perhaps from Zeus. These whispers fed a boy's imagination. Where another prince might have been content with honor in battle, Alexander began to believe that his life was bound to something greater, that omens and gods walked beside him. But Olympias' passion was also fuel for tension. She quarreled with Philip, resented his other wives, feared for Alexander's place. In the palace at Pella, a boy grew up watching not only soldiers train, but also parents clash. A household of ambition, pride, and rivalry. At 16, Alexander was left as regent while Philip campaigned elsewhere. In his father's absence, he crushed a local rebellion, founded a city, and named it Alexandropolis, already stamping his name upon the map. But his true test came 2 years later, in 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip had brought the Macedonian army south into Greece, where Athens and Thebes, wary of his growing power, had formed an alliance. The field of battle lay near the town of Chaeronea, where plains met hills, where the dust of summer clung to every breath. The Greek alliance fielded hoplites, armoured and proud, while Philip commanded his drilled phalanx and cavalry. The armies clashed in a thunder of bronze and spear. At the Macedonian left, Alexander commanded the companion cavalry. Though still only 18, he did not hesitate. At the right moment, he drove his cavalry forward, straight into the Theban sacred band, an elite corps of men bound by oath and devotion. The clash was brutal, horses screaming, spears shattering, shields ringing with blows. Alexander himself is said to have struck down leaders, cutting into the very heart of Theban resistance. When the battle ended, the Greeks lay broken. Athens retreated. Thebes bled. Macedon stood victorious. For Alexander, this was no mere skirmish. It was his first taste of command, his first mark upon history. From that day, soldiers who had once seen him as only a prince saw him as a warrior in his own right. Yet victory was not peace. Philip's ambition was growing. He planned campaigns against Persia itself, gathering allies, preparing fleets. But ambition makes enemies. In 336 BCE, at Aegi, Philip prepared to celebrate the marriage of his daughter. The court gathered in splendor, nobles in rich robes, soldiers in shining armor. Alexander was there, as was Olympias. As Philip entered the theater, a bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward and struck him down with a dagger. The king of Macedon fell dead before his court. Panic erupted, then silence. The great conqueror was gone in an instant. In the chaos that followed, Alexander, only 20 years old, stood poised between ruin and rule. Rivals whispered. Enemies stirred. Olympias moved to protect her son. And within days, Alexander had seized the throne, commanding loyalty, quelling dissent, inheriting not only Philip's crown, but also his unfinished ambition. It is worth pausing here, at this threshold of kingship. Picture Alexander standing before his father's body, the air heavy with incense, the murmurs of courtiers filling the hall. He is young still, his face smooth, his hair bright, his eyes burning. Around him swirl grief, suspicion, ambition. Behind him, the lessons of Aristotle and the training fields of Macedon. Before him, the vast unknown of empire. Imagine him walking the palace corridors at night, the torches burning low, the shadows long. He passes rooms where once he studied, courtyards where once he played. Now every gaze falls upon him. Every whisper wonders, can he hold the kingdom? Can he carry Philip's legacy? Can he surpass it? He pauses, perhaps, at a window overlooking the plains. The night air is cool, the stars scatter across the sky. He whispers lines of Homer, remembering Achilles, remembering glory. And in that whisper is not only grief for his father, but also the spark of resolve. For Alexander, destiny has opened its gates, and he will not walk, but ride through them. So ends the youth of Alexander, a boy trained in philosophy and war, a son shaped by a king and a queen, by the iron of Philip and the fire of Olympias, a youth tested at Chaeronea, crowned by sudden death, thrust onto the throne at 20. Behind him lies Pella, the palace of his childhood. Before him lies the world. The boy has become a king, and the king already dreams of conquest. When Alexander became king at the age of 20, the crown weighed heavily upon his brow, but ambition burned even heavier within his chest. Philip had prepared the ground, shaping Macedon into a spear. Alexander would be the one to cast it. In the first days of his rule, danger pressed in from every side. Enemies whispered that he was too young, too untested. Greek city-states stirred restlessly, thinking Macedon might falter without Philip. Rivals at court plotted, wondering if another heir might claim the throne. But Alexander acted swiftly. He stamped out rebellion with decisive marches, his army at his back. In Thessaly, in Thrace, in the northern lands, he appeared before rebels with sudden speed, crushing resistance before it could spread. His presence was enough tall, bright-eyed, his movements confident, his words sharp. Already he carried himself not as a boy, but as a king. The companions who had ridden with him since childhood now swore loyalty anew. The army, forged by Philip but beloved by Alexander, followed him with fierce devotion. Soon, the Greek states bowed again to Macedon. The alliance Philip had formed, the Corinthian League, confirmed Alexander as its leader. The stage was set for the campaign Philip had dreamed of: war against the Persian Empire. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander led his army east. Nearly 40,000 men marched with him: Macedonian phalanxes, companion cavalry, Greek allies, archers, engineers. Behind them trailed supply wagons, scribes, servants, and camp followers. It was a small force compared to the vast might of Persia, but to Alexander it was enough. At the Hellespont, the strait that divides Europe from Asia, the army prepared to cross. The waters shimmered beneath the sun, a boundary between worlds. Here, Alexander performed an act both symbolic and sacred. He sailed to the site of ancient Troy, the city of Homer's epic. He honored Achilles at his tomb, running naked in the traditional race and leaving offerings. He imagined himself heir not only to Philip's throne, but to Homer's heroes, to his men. This was more than ritual. It was a claim to destiny. Then, as his ships ferried soldiers across the strait, Alexander himself took the tiller of the first vessel, guiding it into Asia. He cast a spear into the shore, leapt onto the beach, and declared that he claimed Asia as won by the spear. This was not merely invasion. It was theatre, it was omen. It was Alexander telling the world that a new age had begun. But omens alone could not secure Asia. Persia awaited. At the Granicus River, near the coast of Asia Minor, the satraps of Persia gathered with their forces. Cavalry lined the banks, glittering in armour, their numbers great. For Alexander, this would be his first true test as king and commander beyond Greece. The river was swift, its waters high with spring. To attack across it seemed madness. Advisors urged caution, telling Alexander to wait, to find an easier crossing. But Alexander was never cautious when glory was at stake. He ordered the attack. The Macedonian cavalry charged into the water, hooves splashing, men shouting, spears raised. The current dragged at them, but they pressed forward. Persian horsemen wheeled above, arrows flying, lances thrusting. At the head rode Alexander himself, his helmet bright with a white plume, easy to see, impossible to ignore. He fought fiercely, struck at by Persian nobles, his companions rallying to protect him. One blow split his helmet, nearly ending his life, but another cut down the attacker, before the strike could fall again. Through the chaos, the Macedonians forced their way up the bank. The phalanx pressed behind, their sarissas bristling like a wall of iron. Step by step, they pushed the Persians back. By day's end, the Persians fled. The satraps were scattered. The first battle in Asia was won. In the aftermath, Alexander did something unusual. Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were captured. He executed some, but he also sent many home in chains, a warning to those who would serve the enemy. Yet to the Persian nobility he captured, he often showed mercy, treating families with respect, sparing women and children. This balance of ferocity and generosity became part of his legend. He could be ruthless on the battlefield, but magnanimous afterward. His soldiers admired his courage, for he fought in the front lines, bleeding as they bled. His enemies, even when defeated, often found themselves astonished by his dignity. It is worth pausing here, on the banks of the Granicus, in the quiet after battle. The air is thick with the smell of trampled grass and churned mud. The river still flows, its surface dappled by the fading light of evening. Soldiers tend to wounds, bind their comrades, lift the fallen. Horses drink deeply, their flanks still heaving. And there among them stands Alexander, his armor dented, his plume torn, his cheek bloodied. He is young still, only 22. But in this moment he seems ageless. His eyes are alight, not only with victory, but with vision. For him, this is not a single battle. It is the opening of a vast horizon. Imagine him gazing eastward, past the hills of Asia Minor, past the lands of Persia, towards cities and rivers and mountains yet unseen. Already he dreams of Babylon, of Persepolis, of the Indus and beyond. Already the world feels smaller to him, waiting only to be crossed. From the Granicus, Alexander pressed forward into Asia Minor. Cities surrendered or resisted. Those who resisted were taken by storm. Those who yielded were treated kindly. This dual policy spread both fear and loyalty. At Ephesus, he restored democratic government, winning the favor of the people. At Halicarnassus, he faced stubborn resistance and fierce siege warfare, battering walls with engines, repelling sorties with fire. The city eventually fell, and Alexander moved on. Everywhere he went, he left behind not only garrisons, but also messages. Macedon was here, and Macedon would stay. It is worth imagining Alexander again at Troy, standing on the ancient plain where Hector once fought Achilles. The wind moves through the tall grass. The sea glimmers in the distance. He walks among ruins, touching stones worn smooth by centuries. For him, these are not lifeless relics. They are reminders of what men before him achieved, and what glory endures. In the silence, he may whisper to himself lines from Homer, hearing not only the past but also his own name echoing forward. In this way, Alexander's conquest was never only military. It was myth, destiny, theatre, a story he wrote with each step. Thus began Alexander's conquest of Asia, with a spear cast into foreign soil, with blood spilled at the Granicus, with cities taken and omens honoured. He was no longer only the boy of Pella, no longer only Philip's son. He was Alexander, king of Macedon, commander of armies, heir to Achilles. The river Granicus still flowed, but its waters had been crossed. Behind him lay Europe, ahead of him stretched the world. And Alexander, standing tall beneath the eastern sky, was ready to claim it. The Granicus had been crossed, the first blood spilled, the first victories won. But for Alexander, this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the heart of the Persian Empire, a realm vast and ancient, whose kings commanded armies and treasuries far greater than Macedon's. To challenge Persia was to challenge the weight of centuries. Yet Alexander marched on, his steps echoing into legend. Word of the young Macedonians' advance spread quickly. Satraps fell, cities changed allegiance, and soon even the great king himself, Darius III, took notice. Darius gathered a vast host, determined to crush the upstart before he could threaten the empire's core. Alexander, still in his early 20s, led his smaller army with confidence. He knew he could not match Persia in numbers, but he believed in speed, in discipline, in the shock of decisive blows. Above all, he believed in himself. In 333 BCE, the two armies met near the town of Issus, on a narrow plain pressed between mountains and sea. The Persian army stretched vast, its banners rippling, its soldiers glittering in ranks. Darius himself stood at the centre, surrounded by royal guards, confident in sheer numbers. Alexander's army was smaller, weary from long marches. Yet the ground itself favoured the Macedonian phalanx. The plain was narrow, leaving little room for the Persians to manoeuvre. When the battle began, the clash was immense. Persian archers loosed volleys that darkened the sky. Cavalry thundered forward. But Alexander led his companion cavalry in a furious charge straight at the Persian centre. He aimed not at the common soldiers, but at Darius himself. Dust filled the air, the sound of iron on iron rang out, men shouted and fell. Through the chaos, Alexander pressed closer, his spear poised. Darius, seeing the Macedonian king cutting through his guard, lost heart. The great king turned his chariot and fled, his army collapsing in panic behind him. The field was left to Alexander. The treasure of Darius's camp fell into his hands, along with the king's family, his wife, mother, and children. In this moment, Alexander showed again his strange balance of ferocity and grace. He treated the family of Darius not as spoils, but as honoured guests, protecting their dignity, ensuring they lacked nothing. To Darius's mother, who feared death, he bowed with respect, calling her mother. This act shocked many. To Alexander, it was not weakness but power. The power to rule not only through fear, but through loyalty and respect. He was not merely a conqueror. He was presenting himself as a king worthy of Persia itself. It is worth pausing here, in the stillness after Issus. Imagine the battlefield, the plain by the sea. The waves lap quietly against the shore, though only hours before men screamed and fell. The mountains cast long shadows in the evening light. The air smells of sweat, of blood, of trampled earth, and there stands Alexander, his armor dented, his hair matted with dust, his eyes alive. Behind him lie heaps of captured treasure, and before him lies the thought of empire itself. Picture him walking through the deserted tents of Darius, silks fluttering in the night breeze, golden vessels glinting in torchlight. He touches none of it. Instead, he gazes outward, past the campfires, toward the stars. Already his mind is moving, not only to the next battle, but to the shape of a world remade. From Issus, Alexander turned south, pursuing the coastline. Some cities opened their gates to him, others resisted. None resisted so fiercely as Tyre, the great Phoenician city built on an island offshore. Tyre's walls rose high from the sea, its harbours filled with ships. To capture it seemed impossible, but Alexander never accepted impossibility. He ordered a causeway built from the mainland to the island. Day by day, soldiers and engineers dragged stones and timber into the sea, pushing the land itself outward. The Tyrians mocked, launched ships to burn the works, rained arrows and fire from their walls. Yet Alexander pressed on. Month after month, the causeway grew, until at last siege towers rolled forward, engines hurled stones, and Macedonian soldiers stormed the walls. The fighting was brutal house to house, street to street. When the city finally fell, Alexander's wrath was fierce. Thousands killed, survivors enslaved, the city scarred forever. It was a lesson to the world: resist and be destroyed, yield and be spared. Southward still he marched, toward Egypt. At Gaza, another stubborn fortress barred his path. For months, Alexander besieged it, building ramps, battering gates, enduring arrows from above. Twice he was wounded, once by a stone that struck his shoulder, yet he returned to the front lines until the city fell. Through these sieges, the army learned their king would never ask of them what he himself would not do. Wounded, dusty, sleepless, Alexander still stood in the thick of danger, and for this, his men loved him beyond measure. By late 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt. The people, wary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, the living son of Amun. Priests hailed him, crowds cheered, offerings were laid before him. Here, Alexander's conquest became more than military. It became sacred theatre. He was not only a Macedonian king, he was a god, king of Egypt, a figure embraced by cultures beyond his own. He ordered the foundation of a new city near the sea, a city that would bear his name, Alexandria. He designed it with broad streets, harbours, and markets, imagining it as a crossroads of the world. Yet Alexander hungered for more than crowns. He sought confirmation of his destiny. From the Nile, he led a small company west into the desert, across shifting sands and scorching sun. Days of silence, broken only by the wind. Water was scarce, the path uncertain, yet Alexander pressed on until they reached the distant oracle of Ammon at Siwa. There, in the sanctuary, the priests received him as a son of the god. They whispered answers only he heard. Some said they called him divine, others that they confirmed his lineage, his destiny. What exactly was spoken remains a mystery. But when Alexander emerged, he carried himself differently, more than a king, more than a conqueror. To his men, he now seemed touched by the divine, his authority no longer earthly alone. It is worth pausing here, in the desert silence of Siwa. Imagine the sands stretching endless, the sun burning white, the air trembling with heat. The silence is vast, broken only by the sigh of wind. And in that silence walks Alexander, a mortal man who believes himself chosen. Picture him standing in the shadow of the temple. The priests behind him, his companions before him. His face is calm, his eyes distant, as though he has seen something beyond human sight. For us, centuries later, the words remain unknown. But for Alexander, they were enough. Enough to turn ambition into certainty, conquest into destiny. Thus, the road to empire widened. From Issus to Tyre, from Gaza to Egypt, from the temple at Siwa to the founding of Alexandria, Alexander strode as both conqueror and chosen. The Persian king had fled once, but Persia itself still stood vast before him. Babylon, Persepolis, the heart of an empire, all awaited. But already, Alexander was no longer simply a Macedonian prince. He was a figure claimed by Greeks, by Egyptians, by oracles and omens. He was a king whose name crossed borders, whose image glowed with divinity. And still, his journey pressed on, eastward, ever eastward. For Alexander, this is the crescendo of his conquest, Gaugamela, the burning of Persepolis, and the fall of Darius. The pacing will be a 401-500 words, with immersive detail, pauses, and reflective closings. Alexander's march had carried him from the Hellespont to Egypt, from Troy's ruins to the oracle at Siwa. He had defeated satraps, humbled kings, and claimed crowns. Yet the true test still lay ahead, for Persia was not only a patchwork of provinces, it was an empire, vast, ancient, and proud. Its heart still beat in Babylon, in Susa, in Persepolis. To claim Asia, Alexander would have to strike at that heart. The great king, Darius II, was not yet finished. Twice defeated, he gathered once more the full might of Persia. In 331 BCE, he assembled an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Cavalry, infantry, chariots with scythe, blades, even war elephants. From the plains near the village of Gaugamela, the Persian host stretched across the horizon, a glittering sea of men and weapons. Alexander's army was far smaller, perhaps 7,000, yet his men were veterans now, hardened by battles, loyal beyond doubt. They had followed him across rivers and deserts, through sieges and storms. They had seen him bleed at Granicus, charge at Issus, stand unbroken at Tyre. To them, he was no longer only a king. He was destiny itself, walking among them. The morning of battle was clear. The plain stretched wide, chosen by Darius for its openness, where his numbers might envelop Alexander. Chariots with scythed wheels gleamed, ready to carve paths through infantry. Alexander surveyed the ground. He saw not only the Persian host, but also its weakness. He stretched his own lines thin, extending his right flank, drawing the Persians out. The battle began with thunder. Chariots charged, wheels slicing through dust. But Macedonian soldiers were ready. At Alexander's command, they opened ranks, letting the chariots pass, then struck riders down with spears and swords. Then Alexander seized his moment. Leading the companion cavalry, he formed a wedge and drove straight at the Persian centre. Dust rose, metal clashed, cries echoed. Through the chaos, he pressed forward, eyes fixed on one figure. Darius, the great king, wavered. Seeing Alexander break through, he lost his nerve, turned his chariot, and fled once again. The Persian army, vast as it was, dissolved into panic. The field belonged to Alexander. In the aftermath of Gaugamela, Alexander stood not only as victor, but as master of Asia. Babylon opened its gates to him. Susa followed, its treasuries spilling gold and silver into his hands. With these riches, he rewarded his men, secured his rule, and financed further campaigns. And then came Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the heart of its kingship, the city of palaces raised by Darius the Great and Xerxes. The march to Persepolis was long, through narrow passes and mountain valleys. Winter winds cut across the ridges, yet Alexander pressed forward, determined to seize the jewel of the empire. When at last he entered, Persepolis lay before him, grand stairways carved with reliefs of tribute, bearers, columns soaring toward the sky, halls whose walls glowed with painted scenes of kings enthroned. To stand there was to feel the weight of centuries, the pride of Persia itself. At first, Alexander treated the city with restraint, allowing its people to live, securing its treasures. But then came fire. The reasons are debated. Some say he burned Persepolis in drunken revelry, urged on by companions. Others that he did it deliberately, as vengeance for Xerxes' burning of Athens generations before. Flames leapt high, devouring palaces, blackening columns, turning halls to ruin. Alexander watched as the city of kings burned, its stones collapsing, its memory scarred forever. He had conquered Persia not only with sword, but with fire. Yet Darius himself still lived, fleeing eastward, gathering what allies he could. Alexander pursued, determined to end the great king's reign once and for all. Through deserts and mountains, the chase continued. At last, near the land of Bactria, Alexander's scouts found him. Betrayed by his own satrap, left wounded in a cart. When Alexander reached him, Darius was near death. He had been struck by his captors, abandoned to the dust. Alexander is said to have covered him with a cloak, offered him water, and spoken words of respect. Darius died there, not by Alexander's hand, but by treachery, leaving the Macedonian king as the uncontested ruler of Persia. Imagine the ruins of the palaces, columns blackened against the night sky, ashes drifting on the wind. The air smells of smoke and memory, of centuries consumed in flame. Then picture Alexander standing by the body of Darius, the once great king lying still in the dust. The desert is quiet, the mountains distant, the stars cold. Alexander bows his head. In this moment he is both conqueror and mourner, heir and rival. He knows that with Darius's death, he inherits not only land but legacy. The weight of Persia, the crown of Asia, the burden of empire. From this point forward, Alexander was no longer merely the son of Philip, the conqueror of Greece, or even the invader of Asia. He was the king of kings, heir to Cyrus, master of Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. Yet with this transformation came questions. How should he rule? As a Macedonian over Persians, or as a Persian king himself? He began to adopt elements of Persian dress, to bow in Persian style, to blend customs of East and West. To his soldiers, proud Macedonians, this was troubling. To Alexander it was vision, the uniting of two worlds. Thus, Alexander entered the heart of Persia. At Gaugamela, he shattered the great king's army. At Babylon and Susa, he claimed the wealth of centuries. At Persepolis, he burned the memory of empires past. And at the death of Darius, he became master of Asia. The boy who once tamed a horse in Pella now ruled half the known world. His name was carried on the lips of subjects from the Nile to the Tigris, from the Aegean to the Persian plateau. But still he was restless, for beyond Persia lay new horizons, Bactria, Sogdiana, India, and Alexander, never content, turned his gaze eastward once more. The Persian Empire lay broken. Darius was dead. Babylon and Persepolis lay behind him. And the crown of Asia rested on Alexander's head. Another man might have stopped here, content to rule as king of kings, content to sit in the palaces of Persia, and let tribute flow from every corner of the world. But Alexander was not another man. His hunger was not for rest, but for horizons. And so, while others urged consolidation, Alexander turned his eyes farther east, to lands half legendary, where maps faded into rumour, where riches and kingdoms were said to lie beyond the edge of Persia. North and east of Persia stretched the rugged lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions of high mountains, deep valleys, and fierce tribes who bowed to no empire easily. To march here was no simple conquest of cities, but a grueling struggle against terrain, rebellion, and resistance. Alexander's army crossed harsh deserts where water was scarce, then climbed mountain passes where snow chilled their breath. Ambushes harried them, local kings resisted with sudden strikes, and more than once the Macedonians wondered if they had marched beyond the limits of reason. But Alexander would not retreat. He built fortresses in remote places, founded cities bearing his name, and pressed deeper. In these campaigns, he learned not only how to win battles, but how to hold lands, by placing garrisons, marrying local traditions with Macedonian order, and binding enemies through both fear and favour. It was here that Alexander met Roxina, the daughter of a noble from Bactria. Accounts differ on how. Some say she was captured after a siege, others that she was offered in alliance. But whatever the truth, Alexander was struck by her beauty and spirit. He married her, not only as strategy but with genuine affection. For a moment, amid dust and war, the restless king allowed himself tenderness. Yet the east was not easily subdued. Even as Alexander advanced, rebellions flared behind him. Cities rose in defiance, tribes resisted from mountain strongholds. Each time, Alexander returned with speed, crushing uprisings, punishing leaders, razing walls. At times his ruthlessness shocked even his own men. Whole towns were destroyed, populations uprooted, leaders executed in public. To some, it seemed cruelty. To Alexander, it was necessity. He could not afford endless rebellion while he marched ever farther. He ruled through a mixture of awe and terror, and in this he succeeded. But beneath the victories, his men began to feel the weight of endless marching. For them, Persia had been the goal, its riches, its glory. Now they were far beyond familiar lands, chasing visions into mountains and deserts. The seed of weariness was sown, though it would not yet grow full. By 327 BCE, Alexander turned his gaze toward India. To the Greeks, it was a land half mythical, of elephants and strange rivers, of gold and wonders beyond imagining. To Alexander, it was simply the next horizon. He crossed the Hindu Kush, leading his men along treacherous paths, enduring storms, avalanches, and hunger. Many perished in the cold, yet still they pressed on. At last they descended into the lands of the Indus, where new kingdoms awaited. Here, Alexander founded more cities, struck alliances with some rulers, and subdued others by force. His march was no longer a simple conquest. It was a tide flowing ever eastward, reshaping the world it touched. In 326 BCE, on the banks of the Hydaspes rivers, modern Jhelum, Alexander faced one of his most formidable opponents, King Porus of India. Porus commanded an army unlike any Alexander had faced, not only cavalry and infantry, but war elephants, massive beasts armoured and trained for battle. Their size alone terrified the Macedonians, who had never fought such creatures. The river lay between them, swollen with rain. To cross under Porus's watch seemed impossible. Yet Alexander, master of cunning, devised a plan. By night, under storm and thunder, he led part of his army upstream, crossing in silence. When dawn broke, Porus saw the Macedonians upon him. The battle was fierce. Elephants charged, trampling men beneath their feet, tusks tearing, riders hurling javelins. Horses panicked at their smell, soldiers scattered at their approach. Yet Alexander's men fought with discipline, surrounding the elephants, striking at their legs and drivers. Slowly, the beasts panicked, turning upon their own lines. Through the chaos, Alexander pressed forward. The battle became slaughter, yet Porus himself fought bravely, towering upon his elephant, refusing to yield until wounded and captured. When brought before Alexander, the king asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander, struck by his dignity, spared him, restored his lands, and even granted him more. In this, as always, Alexander balanced conquest with respect, ruthlessness with mercy. After Hydaspes, Alexander pressed deeper into India, seeking new conquests. But here, for the first time, he met resistance not from enemies, but from his own men. They had marched for years, crossed deserts and mountains, fought in countless battles. Their armor was dented, their sandals worn thin, their faces weathered by endless campaigns. They longed for home, for rest, for familiar soil. At the Hyphasis River, modern Bees, they refused to march farther. Alexander pleaded, raged, offered promises of glory. But his men stood firm. For the first time, the will of the army bent the will of the king. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. Imagine that moment at the Hyphasis. The river flows quietly, birds skim its surface, the jungle breathes with unseen life. Alexander stands upon the bank, gazing eastward into lands unknown. His heart strains toward them, restless, hungry still. Yet behind him, thousands of wary eyes wait, unyielding. He realizes then that even kings cannot conquer without followers. That ambition must bow to limits of flesh and spirit. For the first time, Alexander knows the edge not of geography, but of human endurance. Thus ended the eastward march. In Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander learned to rule distant lands, to crush rebellions, to bind enemies through marriage and fear. In India he faced elephants and kings, rivers and jungles, and won. Yet at the Hyphasis he was forced to stop, not by defeat, but by exhaustion, by the simple weight of years of war. The boy of Pella, the conqueror of Persia, the heir of Achilles, had reached the edge of the known world. And though he turned back, the vision of what lay beyond burned still within him. Alexander had reached the limits of his men's endurance. At the Hyphasis River, where the jungle pressed close and the air hung heavy with monsoon rains, they refused to march farther. No speeches, no promises of riches, no invocations of glory could move them. For the first time, the army that had followed him across continents said no. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. The dream of reaching farther east, of seeing oceans no Greek had seen, was set aside. Yet even in retreat, his journey was far from over. The return westward was marked not by triumph, but by trial. Alexander divided his forces, part by sea, part through the heart of the Gedrosian desert. The desert was merciless. Sand stretched endless, water scarce, the sun a burning hammer by day, the nights bitter cold. Supplies ran thin, men collapsed from thirst, animals perished in the heat. Some accounts say entire columns vanished, swallowed by shifting dunes. Alexander shared their suffering. He marched on foot beside them. refused water when his men had none, lifted the fallen with his own hands. Once, when a helmet filled with precious water was brought to him, he poured it out upon the sand before all, declaring he would not drink when his soldiers thirsted. The gesture, though it cost him dearly, bound his army closer still. By the time they emerged from the desert, thousands had perished. Yet those who survived carried a bond of endurance that no victory could equal. In 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon, the city that had once bowed before him. Now it became the center of his empire. Here he began to plan, not to rest, but to build. He envisioned fleets to explore the Persian Gulf, campaigns into Arabia, roads linking east and west. He spoke of uniting his subjects, of blending Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Egyptian, into a single people. He encouraged marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen. He welcomed Persians into his administration, training them in Macedonian ways while himself adopting elements of Persian dress and ceremony. To some, this was vision the dream of a world united. To others, especially his Macedonian veterans, it was betrayal, the blurring of identity, the loss of home. Yet Alexander pressed forward. His gaze was never backward, always to horizons yet unseen. But in the midst of plans came grief. His closest companion, Hephaestion, the man who had been with him since boyhood, fell ill and died suddenly. The loss struck Alexander like a wound deeper than any spear. He mourned with intensity, refusing food, cutting his hair in grief, ordering vast funeral rites. Temples were built, sacrifices made, cities renamed in Hephaestion's honor. For a man who had conquered half the world, this was the battle he could not win: the silence of death, the absence of the one who had shared his dreams. From this point onward, Alexander seemed more restless, more haunted, as though he sensed time itself turning against him. By the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander was preparing yet another campaign, this time into Arabia. Ships were built, supplies gathered, troops mustered. Babylon buzzed with activity, a city alive with anticipation. And then suddenly, the king fell ill. Accounts differ. Some say it began with a fever after a banquet, others that he was struck with pain after drinking wine. Day by day, his condition worsened. He could no longer walk, then no longer speak. His generals gathered anxiously, the army waiting outside the palace for news. Rumors spread that he had been poisoned, that the gods themselves had struck him, that his exhaustion had simply overcome him. None could be proven. At last, too weak to rise, Alexander was carried to the river to greet his soldiers one final time. Unable to speak, he raised his hand in silent farewell. The men wept, stretching their arms toward him, unwilling to believe the one who had led them across the world could now be fading. On June 10, 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He left no clear hair, only a vast empire stretching from Greece to India, an empire too immense to be held by any single successor. His generals, the companions who had marched with him, soon divided it among themselves in the wars of the Diadochi. His body, it is said, was placed in a golden sarcophagus, later borne to Egypt, where it rested in Alexandria. There, pilgrims came for centuries to gaze upon the face of the man who had once seemed a god. Imagine that moment in Babylon, the palace quiet, the air heavy with incense, torches flickering low. Outside, thousands of soldiers stand in silence, their king slipping from them. Inside, Alexander lies upon his bed, his breath shallow, his gaze distant. What does he see in those final moments? The plains of Gaugamela, the elephants of Hydaspes, the deserts of Gedrotia. Or does he see farther still, beyond horizons, into dreams unfinished? For Alexander's life was never about rest, never about endings. It was about seeking, about reaching, about always pressing forward. Even in death, his story feels unfinished, his ambition echoing beyond the grave. So passed Alexander the Great, a man who conquered more in a decade than most empires in centuries, yet who lived only 32 years. He left behind no lasting heir, no stable throne, but he left behind a legend. Cities bore his name, generals bore his legacy, and history bore his memory. His empire fractured, but his vision endured that the world might be seen not as separate kingdoms, but as one vast stage for human ambition. In the end, Alexander did not die in battle, but in silence in Babylon, the heart of the empire he had remade. Yet his name lived on, carried by centuries, spoken still today. When Alexander died in Babylon, the world seemed to pause. His soldiers, who had followed him from Macedon to India, wept openly. His generals looked at one another, not knowing whether to cling together or tear the empire apart. The question was simple and devastating: who would rule? Alexander had left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant. His half-brother Aridaeus was of weak mind. Into this vacuum rushed ambition. The generals who had once been brothers, in arms became rivals. They divided the empire among themselves, each seizing a portion, each claiming to guard Alexander's legacy, each in truth guarding their own power. The empire fractured into kingdoms. The Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Antigonids in Macedon. Wars raged, alliances shifted, dynasties rose and fell. Yet through all this turmoil, one thing remained constant: the name of Alexander. Even in his own lifetime, Alexander had cultivated myth. He had linked himself to Achilles at Troy, sought recognition from the oracle at Siwa, spoken of his own divinity. He had carried Homer with him, quoting verses before battle. He had staged his conquests not only as wars but as epics. After his death, these myths only grew. Stories spread that he was the son of Zeus, born of thunder, that he had descended to the bottom of the sea in a glass bell, risen to the heavens in a chariot pulled by griffins, that he had wept when no more worlds remained to conquer. Whether true or false mattered little. The stories spoke to something deeper, to the sense that Alexander was not merely a man, but a symbol of what humans might reach when they refused to stop. Like Leonardo, Alexander was a man of contradictions. He was ruthless, burning Persepolis, slaughtering Tyre, executing rivals without hesitation. Yet he was merciful, sparing Porus, honouring Darius's family, bowing before a defeated queen. He was Macedonian to his soldiers, yet Persian to his subjects, Egyptian to his priests, Greek to his philosophers. He wore many identities, never wholly one thing. He was brilliant, tactician, strategist, visionary, yet also reckless, charging headlong into danger, wounded again and again, risking all for a single strike. He dreamed of unity, of blending cultures, of a world bound together. Yet he left chaos, an empire fractured, wars without end. To look at him is to see not clarity, but paradox. Why, then, do we remember him? He was not the only conqueror. Others have held empires larger, longer, more enduring. Rome outlasted him by centuries. China's dynasties spanned millennia. Napoleon marched nearly as far. But Alexander endures not for the size of his empire, but for the speed, the audacity, the intensity of his life. In barely a decade, he crossed from Greece to India, from boyhood to legend. He lived as though time itself pursued him. And we remember too, because he was more than a general. He carried with him culture, founding cities, spreading language, opening roads between East and West. In his wake, Greek art and thought mingled with Persian and Egyptian traditions, giving rise to the Hellenistic world, a world of science, philosophy, an exchange that shaped centuries to come. We remember because in him we see possibility and danger. The possibility of greatness beyond limits, the danger of ambition without end. Imagine Alexander as a boy in Pella, taming Bucephalus, the wild horse no one else could ride. The sun is bright, the crowd murmurs, and suddenly the horse carries him forward, as though foreshadowing all the journeys to come. Imagine him at Issus, dust swirling, eyes fixed on Darius, his spear levelled, his companions shouting around him. A young king daring to strike at the heart of an empire. Imagine him in Egypt, standing before the priests of Siwa, the desert silent, the air shimmering with heat. He emerges with a calm face, as though touched by something beyond mortal sight. Imagine him at Hydaspes, rain falling, elephants charging, his men clinging to discipline while he presses forward, unyielding. And finally, imagine him in Babylon, weakened by fever, raising his hand to his soldiers one last time, silent, but still commanding devotion with a gesture. Across these moments, we see a life not in stillness, but in motion. Always forward, always pressing, always seeking. What do we take from such a life? Perhaps that ambition is both fire and burden. It can carry us beyond boundaries, but it can also consume us. Alexander lived as though the world were too small for him, and in the end, it was. Perhaps that greatness is not perfection. Alexander was flawed, reckless, cruel at times, but he was also courageous, visionary, inspiring. To demand perfection is to miss the humanity in the myth. Perhaps that mortality spares no one. Alexander died at 32, his empire fragile, his dreams unfinished. Yet his name endures, while many longer reigns are forgotten. And perhaps, above all, that to seek is itself a form of glory. For Alexander never stopped seeking lands, battles, honors, truths. He lived as though life itself were a horizon, always just beyond reach. Centuries have passed since Alexander's death. Cities he founded still stand. His image still gazes from coins. His story still fills books and classrooms. He rests not in Babylon, not in Macedonia, but in memory, a figure both real and larger than life. Imagine him now, not in armor, not on horseback, but seated quietly at night, a candle burning low. Outside, the world lies vast and silent. Inside, he traces maps in the dust, eyes fixed on horizons unseen. For all his conquests, he still dreams of what lies beyond. In that image, he is no longer only king, or conqueror, or god. He is simply human, restless, searching, unfinished. Alexander the Great lived only 32 years, yet those years reshaped the world. He left behind not answers, but questions. Not peace, but possibility. Not permanence, but legend. He reminds us that to be human is to reach, to strive, to ask always what lies beyond the horizon. And so, as you rest tonight, let his story linger. Not as a tale of battles and crowns, but as a meditation on ambition, on limits, on the mystery of life itself. Alexander pressed ever forward, never content, never finished. And in that, perhaps, we find both warning and inspiration, that greatness is not in holding the world, but in seeking it. The candle burns low, the night deepens, the king sleeps, and with him, the dream of horizons still unfinished.